They had removed the young caballero's clothes and were tying him to the skinning post outside the big cave when Tudwal came loping into camp with news he thought Ahumado would want to hear. Ahumado sat on a blanket outside the cave, watching old Goyeto sharpening his skinning knives. The blades of the old man's knives were thin as razors. He only used them when Ahumado wanted him to take the skin off a man. The young caballero had let a cougar slip into the horses and kill a foal. Though Ahumado never rode himself, he preferred to walk, he was annoyed with the young man for letting a fine colt get eaten by the cougar. Ahumado also preferred sun to shade. Even on the hottest days, he seldom went into the big cave or any of the caves that dotted the yellow cliffs. He put his blanket where the sun would shine on it all day, and all day he sat on it. He never covered himself from the sun. He let it make him blacker and blacker. Tudwal dismounted well back from the skinning post and waited respectfully for Ahumado to summon him and hear his news. Sometimes Ahumado summoned him quickly, but at other times the wait was long. When the old man was meting out punishment, as he was about to do, it was unwise to interrupt him, no matter how urgent the news. Ahumado was deliberate about everything, but he was particularly deliberate about punishment. He didn't punish casually. He made a ceremony of it, and he expected everyone in camp to stop whatever they were doing and attend to what was being done to the one receiving the punishment. When the young caballero, stripped and trembling with fear, had been securely tied to the skinning post, Ahumado motioned for old Goyeto to come with him. The two men were about the same age and about the same height, but of different complexions. Goyeto was a milky brown, Ahumado like an old black rock. Goyeto had 7 knives which he wore on a narrow belt, each in a soft deerskin sheath. He was bent almost double with age and only had one eye, but he had been skinning men for Ahumado for many years and was a master with the knives. He carried with him a little pot of blue dye to mark the places that Ahumado wanted skinned. The last man whose skin he had removed entirely was a German who had tried to make away with some rocks he had taken from one of Ahumado's caves. Ahumado did not like his caves disturbed, not by a German or anybody. It was rare, though, for him to order a whole man skinned. Often Goyeto would only skin an arm or a leg or a backside or even an intimate part. Tudwal didn't expect him to be that hard on the young vaquero, who had only made a small, understandable mistake. It soon developed that he was right. Ahumado took the little pot of dye and drew a line from the nape of the caballero's neck straight down to his heel. The line was not even an inch wide. Ahumado lifted the boy's foot, drew the line across the sole of his foot, and stepped around him to the other side. Then he carefully continued the line all the way up to the boy's chin. Ahumado pulled the boy's face around so he could look right in his eye. "I do not raise horses for cougars to eat," he said. "I'm going to have Goyeto take an inch of your skin. Goyeto is so good with the knives that you may not feel it. But if you do feel it, please don't yell too much. If you disturb me with too much yelling, I may have him skin your cojones, or maybe one of your eyeballs." Then he walked back to his blanket and sat down. He could see that Tudwal was anxious to tell him something. Usually, while a torture was being performed, he made his couriers wait. It was hard to take in the news accurately when a man was screaming only a few feet away. But Tudwal had been sent north toward the border, and it was never wise to ignore news from the border country. He motioned to Tudwal, who came hurrying over. Just as he got there, old Goyeto made a few cuts and began to peel the little strip of skin down the nape of the young caballero's neck. The boy, not understanding that he was being given only a light punishment, began to scream as loudly as he could. As Goyeto pulled and cut, pulling the strip below the boy's shoulder blades, the boy screamed so loudly that it was impossible to hear Tudwal's news. Before the strip of skin was pulled away past his hips, the boy fainted, and Goyeto stopped and squatted on his heels. Ahumado did not approve of him skinning unconscious men. "2 Comanches are coming," Tudwal said quickly. "They're almost to the Yellow Canyon now." Ahumado was disappointed by the quality of news from the north. 2 Comanches were worthless. He had been hoping that Tudwal might have spotted a party of rich travelers, or perhaps a small troop of federales. The rich people might have money and jewels with them, the soldiers they could torture. He motioned for Galleto to get on with things, so Galleto pricked the caballero's cojones with the knives until he woke up. Soon he was screaming again, though not so loudly. Of course, Tudwal had known that Ahumado would not be excited to hear about the 2 Comanches. He decided to spring the news that he had been holding back. "One of the Comanches is riding the buffalo horse," he said. "Skull's horse." Ahumado had been watching the practiced way Galleto twisted the boy's foot up and held it between his knees as he continued to peel the strip of skin across the sole. Galleto's expert knife work was a pleasure to watch. It took a moment for Tudwal's information to register with him. The boy was screaming more loudly again. "Skull's horse?" Ahumado asked. "Skull's horse," Tudwal said. "I have more news, too." "You are a braggart," Ahumado informed him. "You are no better than a crow." The old man's face was thin. His eyes were as flint when he was displeased, and he was often displeased. "But I am the crow who sees," Tudwal said. "I have seen the 2 Comanches, and I have seen Skull. He is following the Comanches on foot, and he is alone." "Skull wants to kill me," Ahumado mentioned. "If he is alone, why didn't you catch him?" "I am only a crow," Tudwal said. "How can I be expected to catch such a fierce man?" "I think Skull wants his horse back," Ahumado said. "There is no other horse like the buffalo horse." "Maybe he wants his horse back, I don't know," Tudwal said. "Maybe he just wants to visit you." Ahumado watched as Galleto worked the strip of skin up the boy's leg. He worked with such delicacy that the wound hardly bled. Nonetheless, when the peel reached his hip, the young caballero fouled himself. Then, for the second time, he fainted. "I am going to sell this boy as a slave when he wakes up," Ahumado said. "He is too cowardly to work for me. If the federales caught him and squeezed his cojones, he might betray me." Tudwal agreed. Only a little skinning had reduced the young caballero to a sorry state. "What do you think those Comanches want?" Ahumado asked. "I am asking you because you are the crow who sees." Tudwal knew he had better be careful. When Ahumado was disappointed in one of his men, his disappointment could turn into fury, but a cold fury. The old man kept his eyes hidden and spoke in soft tones, so that the man he was angry with could not see until it was too late that his eyes were like those of a striking snake. Someone would be struck, usually to the death, when Ahumado began to question things. "One of the Comanches is a man called Kicking Wolf," Tudwal ventured. "He took the buffalo horse. Maybe he means to sell him to you." The old man, the black vaquero, said nothing. Tudwal was scared, and when he was scared he spoke nonsense. Ahumado did not buy horses from the Comanches, or do anything else with them except kill them. The best any Comanche could expect from him was a quick death. The Comanche who was bringing him the buffalo horse was doing a foolish thing, or else he was playing a trick. The man could well be a trickster of some sort, allied with a witch. If he was just a plain man with horse trading on his mind, he was making a foolish mistake. "Go eat," he told Tudwal. "Galleto has to finish his work." Relieved, Tudwal left at once. Galleto pulled the strip of skin up the unconscious caballero's chest and up his neck to his chin. Then he cut it off and walked away with the thin, light strip. He meant to peg it out, salt it a little, and hang it in the big cave with all the other human skins he had taken for Ahumado. On little pegs in the cave were more than 50 skins, a collection any skinner could be proud of. From time to time, Ahumado would come into the big cave for a few minutes, take down the skins one by one, and admire them. He and old Galleto would reminisce about the behavior of this captive or that. Some men, like the German who had tried to steal the rocks, behaved very bravely, But others, weak, like the young caballero, were disappointing to work on. They broke down, fouled themselves, and bawled like babies. Outside, on his blanket, with the winter sun reflecting off the yellow walls of the canyon, Ahumado sat, thinking about the 3 men who were coming from the north, Big Horse Skull and the 2 Comanches. The notion that they had come for a visit was amusing. No one visited him in the canyon of the Yellow Cliffs. When the time came for a visit, he would visit them. "What will you say to the black vaquero when he catches us?" 3 Birds asked. They were camped in a long canyon with high walls, a place 3 Birds didn't like. He had lived his life on the open prairie and didn't like sleeping beneath a cliff of rocks. Someone with the power to shake the earth could make one of the cliffs fall on them and bury them, a thing that could never happen on the plains. In his dream he had seen a great cliff falling and had awakened in a sweat. Kicking Wolf had killed a small pig with spiky hair, a javelina, and was too busy roasting its bones to respond to 3 Birds. Then 3 Birds remembered another bad story he had heard about the black vaquero, this one having to do with snakes. It was said that the old man had such power that he had persuaded the rattlesnake people to give up their rattles. It was said that Ahumado had many snakes with no rattles who could crawl among his enemies and bite them without making a sound. Though 3 Birds normally didn't fear the snake people, he didn't like the thought of rattlesnakes that made no sound. The pig they were eating was tasty, but not tasty enough to make him forget that the black vaquero had a number of evil ways. "Have you heard about the snakes without rattles?" 3 Birds asked. "There might be a few of them living in this canyon right here." "If you are going to talk all night, I wish you would go home," Kicking Wolf said. "I don't want to sleep tonight. I want to stay up and sing. If you want to sleep, you had better go somewhere else." "No, I will sing too," 3 Birds said. And he did sing, far into the night. He had the feeling that they would be dead very soon, and he wanted to sing as much as possible before death closed his throat. The 2 Comanches sang all night, and in the morning took pains to paint themselves correctly. They wanted to look like proud Comanche warriors when they rode into the camp amid the yellow cliffs, the camp of the 100 caves, where Ahumado had his stronghold. Kicking Wolf was just about to mount the buffalo horse when he felt a change come. The sun had not yet struck the cliffs to the south. They were still filled with blue light. 3 Birds had just finished painting himself when he felt the change. Sometimes, hours before a storm, the air would begin to change, though there was no sign of anything to fear. That was how the air changed in the long canyon. "I think he is here," Kicking Wolf said, coming over to 3 Birds. Just then 3 Birds saw a rattlesnake without rattles going under a rock near where they had their blankets. He knew then that Ahumado must be near. He wondered if Ahumado's powers were such that he could turn himself into a snake and come near to spy on them. It might even have been Ahumado who crawled under the rock near where the blankets were. He didn't mention his suspicion to Kicking Wolf, though. Kicking Wolf didn't believe that people could turn themselves into animals, or vice versa, though he admitted that such things might have been possible in the old days, when the spirits of people had been more friendly with those of animals. Then the buffalo horse snorted and swung his head. He looked around the canyon, but didn't move. "I don't want to camp in any more canyons," 3 Birds observed. He was about to outline his objections when he turned and saw an old man sitting on a high rock a little distance behind them. The rock and the man were in shadow still. It was hard to see them clearly. He sat cross-legged on the rock, a rifle across his lap. When the light improved a little, they saw that he was as dark as an old plum. Kicking Wolf knew that he was in great danger, but he also felt great pride. The old man on the rock was Ahumado, the black vaquero. Whatever his own fate might be, he had completed his quest. He had stolen the buffalo horse and brought him to the great bandit of the south. He had done it merely for the daring of doing it. If 100 pistoleros rose up in the rocks and killed him, he would die happy in his courage and pride. "I have brought you the buffalo horse," Kicking Wolf said, walking closer to the rock where the old man sat. "I see him," Ahumado said. "Is he a gift?" "Yes, a gift," Kicking Wolf said. "He is a big horse," Ahumado said. "I shot him once, but the bullet only scratched him. Why did you bring him to me?" Kicking Wolf made no answer. There was no answer that could easily be put into words. He knew that at home, around the campfires, the young men would sing for years about his theft of the buffalo horse and his inexplicable decision to take him to Ahumado. Few would understand it, perhaps none would understand it. It was a thing he had done for no reason and for all reasons and for no reason. He stood on his dignity as a Comanche warrior. He would not try to explain himself to an old bandit who was black as a plum. "I will take this horse, and the other one too," Ahumado said. "You can go home, but you will have to walk until you get to Texas. Then you can steal another horse." Kicking Wolf picked up his weapons. He and Three Birds started to walk out of the canyon past where Ahumado sat. But when Three Birds moved, Ahumado made a motion with his rifle, pointing it directly at Three Birds. "Not you," he said. "Your friend can go, but you must stay and be my guest." Three Birds didn't argue. What had happened was exactly what he had expected would happen. He had come to Mexico expecting to die, and now he was going to die. He was not upset. It was a moment he had been waiting for since the shitting sickness killed his wife and his 3 children. He had wanted to die then with his family, but his stubborn body had not wanted to go. But some of his spirit had gone with his wife and his little ones, and he had not been able to attend much to the things of the world since then. Now he had had a good journey with his friend Kicking Wolf. They had traveled together to Mexico. He did not want the evil old man to do bad things to him, but as to his death, that he was at ease with. He immediately stretched up his arms and began to sing his death song. Though Three Birds wasn't upset, Kicking Wolf was. He did not like the disrespectful tone the old man had used when he addressed Three Birds. Even less did he like it that Ahumado meant to keep Three Birds a captive. "This man helped me to bring you the buffalo horse," he said. "He has come a long way to bring you this gift." Ahumado kept his rifle pointed at Three Birds. It was clear that he had no interest in what Kicking Wolf had just said. Kicking Wolf was very angry. He had half expected to die when he had decided to bring the buffalo horse to Mexico. He knew that Ahumado was a very dangerous man who killed on whim, that death might be waiting for him in the canyon of the Yellow Cliffs. Besides, Three Birds had talked of little else on the trip except his conviction that Ahumado would kill them. What he had not expected was that he would be spared and Three Birds taken. It angered him so that he had a notion to put an arrow through the old bandit immediately. Did he think a Comanche warrior would simply surrender his friend to torture and death? By that one stroke, Ahumado made him seem a fool, the very thing Three Birds had been telling him he was all the way south. To make matters worse, Three Birds accepted the decision. He was already singing his death song, and his eyes were looking far away. As Kicking Wolf was about to draw his bow, he saw 3 pistoleros to his left. They rose out of the rocks with their rifles pointed at him. 3 more rose behind Ahumado. "In my country, rocks grow men," Ahumado said. Kicking Wolf dropped his weapons and made a gesture of surrender. He could not simply walk out of the canyon and leave Three Birds to his death. If it was to be death for one, it would be death for both. But Ahumado made a gesture with his hand, and several horsemen rode out of the rocks swinging horsehide ropes. Kicking Wolf tried to run, but before he could escape, 3 lassos caught him. The horsemen began to drag him over the rough ground out of the canyon. He could not see Three Birds for the dust his own body raised as the men spurred their horses and pulled him faster. They pulled him through a field of big rocks. Then his head hit one of the big rocks, which sent him into a black sleep. But even as he sank into the darkness, he thought he heard someone singing a death song. When Buffalo Hump came into the big store in Austin, some of the warriors had found an old woman upstairs and had pulled her and had thrown her down the steps. Now they were dragging her through some white flour. They had killed the old man who owned the store with one of his own axes and had used the axe to chop open a couple of barrels of white flour. Some of the young warriors had never seen white flour and took delight in throwing it in the air and covering themselves with it. They also liked dragging the old woman through it while she shrieked. Two of the young warriors outraged her while Buffalo Hump picked out a few hatchets and put them in a sack. Then he came over and waited for the warrior who was outraging the old woman to finish. The woman's husband was lying dead only a few feet away, while outside his warriors were setting buildings afire and killing people as they tried to escape the flames. Some warriors rode their horses into white people's houses and looted everything they could carry. 6 Texans were shot down in the street and scalped where they fell. The people of Austin ran like chickens, and the Comanches pursued them like wolves, killing them as they ran with lances or arrows or tomahawks. The raid had begun just at dawn, but now the sun was well up. Buffalo Hump knew it was time to leave. The young men would have to throw away much of the loot they carried. They would not be able to carry it if there was a fast pursuit. They had killed 4 rangers in one little house, but had seen no soldiers. When the warrior got off the old flour-splotched woman, Buffalo Hump stood over her and shot 3 arrows into her chest. He shot them with all the force of his bow, so that the arrows went through the woman and nailed her to the floor. The woman died immediately, but Buffalo Hump didn't scalp her. She was just an old woman whose thin hair was worthless. He let his men take what baubles they wanted from the store, but told them to hurry. When he came outside, he saw that some of his warriors had caught a blacksmith and were burning him to death on his own forge. One of them pumped the bellows and made the flames leap, while the blacksmith screamed. The high flames set the man's hair on fire. In the street, a young man with no trousers was running, pursued by 3 warriors. They had stolen ropes from the big store and were trying to rope him as a vaquero would rope a cow. But they were warriors, not ropers, and they kept missing. Finally, unable to rope the young man, the warriors began to whip him with their ropes. Then Red Cat joined the fun. He had stolen an axe with a long handle from the store. While the young man was fleeing, Red Cat swung the axe and tried to cut the young man's head off. The blow killed him, but his head was still on his neck. The warriors dragged him around for a while to make sure he was dead. Then Red Cat finished cutting his head off, and they threw his body in a wagon along with some other bodies. Buffalo Hump saw an old man rolling around in the street. He was dying, but not quite dead. He rode over and did what he had done with the old woman with flour on her. He shot 3 arrows into the old man so hard that they went through him and pinned him to the ground. Buffalo Hump meant to do the same thing again as they went south. At every farm or ranch he would put arrows through some Texan. He would leave them nailed to the floor or to the ground. It would be a thing the Texans would notice, a thing they would remember him by. When Maggie was awakened in the first gray light by the high, wild cries of the Comanche warriors racing into Austin, she didn't even wait to look out the window. Their war cries had been in her nightmares for years. She grabbed a little pistol Woodrow had left her for her own defense and raced barefoot down the stairs. The house she boarded in was on the main street. She knew they would catch her if she stayed in it, but she thought she might be able to squeeze under the smokehouse behind it. An old sow had rooted under the smokehouse so persistently that she had dug out a shallow wallow under the back corner of the shack. Maggie raced down the steps and moments later was squeezing herself under the smokehouse. There was room, too. The black sow was larger than she was. She clutched the pistol and cocked it to be ready. Woodrow had long ago taught her where to shoot herself, to spare herself torture and outrage. Once Maggie had squeezed herself as far back under the house as she could get, she heard from behind her somewhere the buzz of a rattlesnake, at which point she stopped and remained motionless. The snake didn't seem close, but she didn't want to do anything to irritate it further. She didn't want to kill herself either. It would mean the end not only for herself, but for the child inside her, too. She knew what happened to women the Comanches took, though. Only yesterday she had seen poor Maudie Clark sitting on a chair behind the church looking blank. The preacher was letting her sleep in a little room in the church until they located a sister in Georgia who might take her in. Her husband, William, had come one day in a wagon, taken the children, and left without speaking a word to Maudie. He had simply ridden away as if his wife had ceased to exist. And his attitude was what most men's would be. Once fouled by a Comanche or a Kiowa or any Indian, a woman might as well be dead, for she would be considered so by respectable society. Maggie didn't know that she could be befouled much worse by an Indian than she had been by some of the rough men who had used her. But then there were the tortures. She didn't think she could stand them. She clutched her pistol, but otherwise didn't move. The snake's rattling slowly quieted. Probably the rattler had crawled off into a corner. Slowly, very deliberately, Maggie squeezed herself a few more inches back. Then she put her face down. Woodrow had told her Comanches were quick to spot even the smallest flash of white skin. Outside, the war cries came closer. She heard horses go right by the smokehouse. 3 Indians went into the smokehouse just above her. She heard them knocking over crocks and carrying off some of the meat that hung there. Something that smelled like vinegar dripped onto her through a fine crack in the floor. But the Comanches didn't find her. 2 braves stood not far from the hog wallow for a moment, but then mounted and loped off, probably to seek more victims. They didn't fire the smokehouse, but they fired the rooming house. She could smell the smoke and hear the crackle of flames. She was afraid the rooming house might fall onto the smokehouse and set it on fire, but didn't dare come out. The Comanches were still there. She could hear their victims screaming. Horses dashed by, and several more Comanches came into the smokehouse. Maggie kept her face down and waited. She was determined to hide all day if need be. Then she heard a scream she recognized. It was Pearl Coleman screaming. Pearl screamed and screamed. The sound made Maggie want to stop her ears and turn off her mind. She didn't want to think about what might be happening to Pearl out in the street. At least Clara Forsythe was safe, married and gone to Galveston only 5 days before. Maggie concentrated on keeping her head down, and she waited. Woodrow had warned her specifically not to be too quick to come out in the event of a raid. Some of the Comanches would hold back after the main party left, hoping to snatch women or children who were brought out of hiding. Maggie waited. One more Indian did come into the smokehouse, perhaps to snatch a ham or something, but he was there only moments. Maggie peeked briefly and saw the warrior's horse spill out turds right in front of her. The warrior left, and Maggie waited for a long time. When she finally began to inch out, she thought it must be noon at least. When she finally did come out, so did the snake that had buzzed at her earlier. The snake glided through a crack in the lower board and was soon under a bush. Many of the buildings along the main street were burning. The saloon had burned to the ground. Maggie inched around the building, but soon decided there were no Indians still in the town. Several men lay dead in the street, scalped, castrated, split open. She heard sobbing from up the street and saw Pearl Coleman, completely naked and with 4 arrows sticking out of her, walking around in circles, sobbing. Maggie hurried to her and tried to get her to stop weaving around, but Pearl was beyond listening. Her large body was streaked with blood from the 4 arrows. "Oh, Mag," Pearl said, "they got me down before I could run. They got me down. My Bill, he won't want me now. If he gets back alive, he'll be ashamed of me and put me out." "No, Pearl, that ain't true," Maggie said. "Bill won't put you out." She said it to cheer Pearl up a little, but in fact there was no predicting what Long Bill would do when he heard of his wife's defilement. She liked Long Bill Coleman, but there was no knowing how a man would react to such news. At that moment, through the drifting smoke, they saw 3 men with rifles coming cautiously up the street. The sight of them brought home to Pearl the fact that she was unclothed. "Oh, Lord, I'm naked, Maggie. What'll I do?" Pearl asked, trying to cover herself with her bloody hands. It was only when she saw the blood on her own hands that she noticed an arrow in her hip. She put her hand on the arrow, which was only hanging by its tip, and to her surprise it came out. "You got 3 more in your back, Pearl," Maggie said. "I'll get 'em out once I get you inside." "Why, I'm stuck like a pincushion," Pearl said, trying to cover herself with her hands. "Just turn around. Those men don't see us yet," Maggie said. "I'll run in the Forsythe store and borrow a blanket for you to cover with." Pearl turned around and hunched over, trying to make herself as small as possible. Maggie ran across the street, but slowed a little as she came up the steps to the Forsythe store. The windows had all been smashed. A barrel of nails had been heaved through one of them. The barrel had burst when it hit, scattering nails everywhere. Maggie, barefoot, had to pick her way carefully through the nails. As soon as she stepped into the store, she felt something sticky on one foot and assumed she must have cut herself on a nail. But when she looked down, she saw that the blood on her foot was not hers. There was a large puddle of it just inside the door of the store. The display cases had all been smashed and flour was everywhere. Horse blankets, harness, ladies' hats, men's shoes had been thrown everywhere. The brown Pennsylvania crockery that Clara had been so proud of had been smashed to shards. Maggie knew she had stepped in a puddle of blood, but it was dim in the store. She didn't know whose blood it was until she picked her way through the smashed crockery and scattered merchandise, and then suddenly saw Mr. Forsythe, dead on the floor, his head split open as if it had been a cantaloupe. Beyond him a few steps lay Mrs. Forsythe, naked and half-covered with the white flour that had spilled out of the barrels. 3 arrows had been driven into her chest, so hard that they had gone through her, pinning her to the floor. Maggie felt such a shock at the sight that she grew weak. She had to steady herself against the counter. For a moment she thought her stomach might come up. Seeing the naked, spraddled woman with the arrows in her chest made her realize how lucky she was, and how lucky Pearl was, and Clara herself, and all the women who were still alive. She herself wasn't even injured. She had to help those who were. It was no time to be weak. Maggie picked her way back to where the blankets were. Instead of taking 1 blanket, she took 3. One she carefully put over Mrs. Forsythe. The 3 arrows stuck up, but there was nothing she could do about that. The blanket didn't cover her well. It left the poor old woman's thin legs exposed, which seemed wrong. She went back, took another blanket, and used it to cover Mrs. Forsythe's legs. The men would have to deal with the arrows when they came to remove the bodies. Then she put a nice blanket over Mr. Forsythe's split head and went outside to help her friend. One of the men with rifles was standing on the porch when she came out. "How about the Forsythes?" he asked, peering in one of the smashed windows. "They're both dead," Maggie told him. "She's got 3 arrows shot clear through her." Then she opened the other blanket, picked her way through the nails, and wrapped the blanket around Pearl, who was still hunched down in the street. The 3 arrows were still in her back, but at least she was covered decently as Maggie walked her home. As soon as Einar Skull saw the horse in the distance, he hid under a little shelf of rock and waited. The horse, still a long way off, seemed to be alone. Skull took out his binoculars and waited for the horse to come round a little closer, for the animal did not seem to be moving or grazing naturally. It moved slowly and looked back over its shoulder frequently, odd behavior for a lone horse in empty country. More than an hour passed before the horse was close enough for Skull to see that it was dragging a man behind it, an unconscious man and an Indian, securely tied at wrists and ankles and attached to the horse by a rawhide rope. There was nothing to see on the vast, spared desert except the one horse walking slowly, dragging the man. Somebody had obviously wanted the horse to drag the man to death. That somebody, in Skull's view, was probably Ahumado. Famous Shoes had talked much about Ahumado's cruelty to captives. Being dragged to death by a horse was about as mild a punishment as Ahumado allowed anyone, if Famous Shoes was to be believed. When the horse was only 100 yards away, Skull crept down to take a closer look. As he came near, he saw that the tied man's body was just a mass of scrapes with very little skin left on it. Skull watched the southern horizon closely to be sure there were no clouds of dust in the air, such as riders would make. He also watched the bound man closely to see if he was merely feigning unconsciousness. It seemed unlikely that a man so skinned and torn could be capable of threatening him, but many a fallen Indian fighter had been fatally lulled by just such reasonable considerations. Once satisfied that it was safe to approach, Skull stopped the horse. He soon saw that the bound man was breathing. There were no bullet holes in him that Skull could see. On his back was a small quiver with no arrows in it. There was a deep gash in his forehead. The beadwork on the little quiver was Comanche, Skull thought. The thongs at his wrists and ankles had been pulled so tight that his flesh had swollen around the cords. From a swift examination of the horse tracks, Skull determined that the horse was one he had just been following for hundreds of miles. It was Three Birds' horse, but Skull didn't think it was Three Birds who was tied to it. Three Birds was skinny, Famous Shoes had told him, but the bound man was short and stocky. "Kicking Wolf," Skull said aloud. He thought the sound of his name might wake the man up, but of course Kicking Wolf was only his English name. What his Comanche name was, Skull did not know. Skull would have dearly liked to know what had happened to Three Birds, and whether Ahumado was in the vicinity, but he could not expect to get such information from an unconscious man whose language he didn't speak. Now that he was in the country of the Black Vaquero, Skull had taken to traveling mostly by night, letting the stars be his map. He knew that the canyon where Ahumado had his stronghold was crevassed and cut with many small caves, some of them no more than pockmarks in the rock, but some deep enough to shelter a man nicely. Undoubtedly Ahumado would post guards, but Skull had been a commander too long to believe that any arrangement that required men to stay awake long hours in the night was foolproof. If he could sneak in at night and tuck himself into one of the 100 caves, he might, with patience, get a clean shot at Ahumado. Famous Shoes had told him that the old man did not like shade. He spent his days on a blanket and slept outside by a small campfire at night. The trick would be to get in a cave within rifle range. Of course, if he shot Ahumado, the pistoleros might swarm into his cave like hornets and kill him, but maybe not. Ahumado was said to be as cruel and unyielding to his men as he was to captives. Most of the pistoleros might only be staying with him out of fear. With the old man dead, they might just leave. It was a gamble, but Skull didn't mind. Indeed, he had walked into Mexico in order to take just such a gamble. But first he had to get into the Yellow Canyon and find a well-situated cave. Famous Shoes had warned him particularly about a man named Tudwal, a scout whose job it was to roam the perimeters of Ahumado's country and warn him of intruders. "Tudwal will know you are there before you know it yourself," Famous Shoes assured him. "Now, that's too cryptic. What do you mean?" Skull asked. But Famous Shoes would not say more. He had given Skull a warning but would not elaborate, other than to say that Tudwal rode a paint horse and carried 2 rifles. Skull put the man's reticence down to professional jealousy. Famous Shoes missed no track, and evidently Tudwal didn't either. Meanwhile, dusk was turning into night, and Skull had a horse and an unconscious man to decide what to do about. The Comanche very likely was the man Kicking Wolf, the thief who had stolen Hector. In other circumstances, Kicking Wolf was a man he would immediately kill or try to kill. But now the man was unconscious, bound, helpless. With or without Skull, he might not live. With one swipe of his knife, Skull knew that he could cut the man's throat and rid the frontier of a notable scourge. But when he did take out his knife, it was merely to sever the rawhide rope that attached the man to the horse. Then he quickly walked on toward the mountains, leaving the unconscious man tied, but not dead. "Tit for tat, Bible and sword," he said aloud as he walked. Kicking Wolf's daring theft had freed him of a command he was tired of, presenting him with a fine opportunity for pure adventure, solitary adventure, the kind he liked best. He could match his skill against an unforgiving country and an even more unforgiving foe. That was why he had come west in the first place, adventure. The task of harassing the last savages until they were exterminated was adventure diluted with policy and duty. The man who had been tied to the horse was a mystery, and Skull preferred to leave him a mystery. He didn't want to nurse him, nor did he want to kill him. He might be Kicking Wolf or just some wandering Indian old Ahumado had caught. By cutting the rope, Skull had secured the man a chance. If he came to, he could chew his way free and try to make it to water. But Einish Skull didn't intend to waste any of the night worrying the issue. The man could go if he was able. He himself had 10 hours of fast walking to do, and he wanted to be at it. The thought of what was ahead stirred his blood and quickened his stride. He had only himself to consider, only himself to depend on, which was exactly how he liked things to be. By morning, if he kept moving, he should be in the canyon of the Yellow Cliffs. Then he could lie under a rock and wait for the sun to complete its short winter arc. Perhaps when night fell again, if he made good progress, he could crawl through Ahumado's guard and work his way into the cliffs, where he might find a cave deep enough to shelter him for a day. If he could find a suitable cave, he would then need to be sure that his rifle was in good order. He had walked a long distance with the rifle over his shoulder. The sights might well need adjusting. Ahumado was said to be quick, despite his age. Certainly he had been quick the first time Skull went after him. It was not likely that the old man would linger long in plain view once Skull started shooting at him. He needed to cripple him at least with the first shot. Killing him outright would be better still. A brisk, nipping north wind rose during the night, but Skull scarcely noticed it. He walked rapidly, rarely slowing for longer than it took him to make water for 10 hours. Twice he startled small herds of javelina, and once almost stumbled over a sleeping mule deer. Normally he would have shot the deer or one of the pigs for meat, but this time he refrained, remembering Tudwall, the scout who would know he was there even before he knew it himself. It would not do to go shooting off guns with such a man on patrol. Toward dawn, Skull stopped. The closer he got to danger, the keener he felt. For a moment, pissing, he remembered his wife, Inez. The woman thought she could hold him with her hot lusts, but she had failed. He was alone, in Mexico, in the vicinity of a merciless enemy, and yet he found it possible to doubt that there was a happier man alive.